I never thought I'd hear my own family laugh at me like that. Not strangers, not people who didn't know my name. My family. I was standing right there, close enough to touch the table, close enough to hear every word, and yet, in that moment, I was invisible, worse than invisible. I was the joke. My grandson looked me straight in the eyes and said something that froze my blood, not because of his age, but because of where he learned it. Everyone laughed. My daughter-in-law laughed, and my son, my own son, laughed the loudest. That was the moment I understood something most people learn too late. Love doesn't protect you from humiliation. Silence invites it. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been embarrassed by someone who should have defended you? Have you ever swallowed your pride just to keep the peace? Have you ever given so much that people forgot you could ever say no? Because if you think this kind of cruelty only happens in other families, you're wrong. It happens quietly, at dinner tables, at holidays, in rooms full of smiles that don't mean a thing. I stayed quiet that day, not because I was weak, but because I was listening. And what I heard changed everything. That sentence didn't just hurt my feelings, it triggered consequences no one at that table saw coming. Within 24 hours, their comfort cracked, their confidence vanished, and the laughter stopped. Phones rang, cards failed, doors closed. They went from mocking me to begging me overnight. And here's the part that matters most. None of it was accidental. Stay with me. This lesson might save you one day, because what happened next wasn't revenge. It was reality catching up. Before I tell you what my grandson said, before I explain why everyone laughed, before I show you what collapsed the very next morning, listen carefully. If this ever happens to you, you'll wish you subscribed. And if you think you don't need stories like this, ask yourself why that makes you uncomfortable. So stay, because one sentence destroyed an entire family. And by the end of this story, you'll understand how fast respect disappears and how expensive it is to earn back. Before anyone called me a burden, I was a wife. Silas and I didn't start with much. We didn't have inherited money or fancy connections. What we had was discipline. We showed up early. We stayed late. We kept promises even when it cost us sleep. Silas believed in steady work and quiet ownership. He taught me that real security doesn't shout, it waits. When he passed, people expected me to shrink. Widows are supposed to fade into the background, soften their voices, lower their expectations. That never sat right with me. I didn't remarry. I didn't sell what we built. I didn't panic. I learned the numbers. I learned the contracts. I learned how money moves when no one is watching. And slowly, carefully, I became something my family never bothered to ask about. The company Silas and I started wasn't glamorous. No shiny offices, no loud branding, just property, leases, and patience. I reinvested everything. While others chased attention, I bought buildings people ignored. Small commercial spaces, office parks no one bragged about, places that paid on time and asked no questions. That's how EM Legacy grew. Not fast, not flashy, but solid. Most people in town knew the name. Very few knew mine. That suited me fine. I stayed in my modest home, drove the same car year after year, wore clothes that lasted longer than trends. I didn't need to look important. I needed to be prepared. And while my accounts grew quietly, my son grew loudly. He mistook my silence for simplicity. He mistook my restraint for dependence. I let him. When Preston came to me with dreams, I didn't laugh. I listened. When he wanted to start his firm, I didn't lecture him about risk. I bought the building and asked for almost nothing in return. When he wanted a house that made statements, I covered the down payment and handled the paperwork he didn't understand. Private schools, club memberships, summer programs, emergency bridges when payroll came up short. Every time I told myself it was temporary. Every time I believed gratitude would follow, it never did. Instead, help became expectation, expectation became entitlement, and entitlement became contempt. Still, I stayed quiet, because mothers convince themselves that patience will be rewarded, because grandmothers tell themselves that sacrifice keeps families together. We've all known women like this, women who give until giving becomes invisible. To my son and his wife, I was predictable. I wore neutral colors, I arrived on time, I didn't interrupt, I didn't announce what I paid for or what I owned. That made them comfortable. They saw a retired woman with free time, someone useful for errands, someone safe to dismiss, someone who wouldn't push back. They never asked how their bill stayed manageable. They never asked why doors always opened for them. They never asked who made the calls when problems disappeared. They assumed success meant visibility. They were wrong. And the more they believed their version of me, the more careless they became. Looking back, the signs were there. The jokes that landed a little too easily, the way my opinion stopped being requested, the way my presence became optional. I told myself it was generational. I told myself not to take things personally. I told myself love meant endurance. That's the lie women like me grow up with. Endurance has limits. So does generosity. I didn't know when it would happen, but I knew this much even then. People who forget where their stability comes from rarely prepare for its absence. And when the moment arrived, it didn't come with warning. It came with laughter. It didn't happen all at once. That's how these things fool you. At first, it was small. A birthday card that arrived late, a phone call that never came, a holiday plan I learned about after it was already set. When I mentioned it, the responses were always casual. "Oh, things have been hectic. You know how busy we are. We'll make it up to you." They never did. I adjusted my expectations instead, told myself grown children have their own lives, told myself not to keep score. But respect has a way of slipping when no one notices it leaving, and slowly I went from being included to being informed to being forgotten. The shift became clearer when I visited their home. I was no longer welcomed. I was assigned. A coat handed to me without a word, a request to watch my grandson while guests were entertained elsewhere, a pile of clothes left near the door with a casual, "if you're heading out anyway." No one asked, no one thanked. I wasn't family in those moments. I was useful. And the most dangerous thing about being useful is how quickly people stop seeing you as human. I noticed how conversations paused when I entered rooms, how decisions were made without me, even when I was paying for the outcome. Still, I stayed quiet, because silence is easier than confrontation, because women my age are taught to be agreeable, because I didn't want to believe what was happening. My daughter-in-law never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her contempt lived in smiles that didn't reach her eyes, in corrections disguised as suggestions, in the way she spoke about me, not to me. She'd comment on my clothes, my habits, my free time. "Oh, you wouldn't understand. It's a professional thing. This crowd is a bit selective. You're so sweet to offer, but we've got it handled." Handled with my money. She treated me like someone who should feel grateful to be tolerated, like my presence required justification. And the hardest part? My son allowed it. Preston liked to talk about independence. He told stories about risk and grit, about nights he almost lost everything, about how far he'd come on his own. He said these things confidently, often in front of people who didn't know the full picture. I sat there listening, nodding, while he described a life I had quietly financed. The building he worked in, the house he lived in, the safety nets he never acknowledged. He believed his version of events, and once a person starts believing their own praise, gratitude becomes inconvenient. In his mind, I wasn't support, I was background, and backgrounds don't get credit. There were moments I could have corrected him, times I could have reminded him who signed what, who paid when things fell apart. I didn't. I told myself that love meant letting him shine, that pointing out reality would embarrass him. What I didn't realize was that my silence was teaching him something dangerous. It taught him that my role was permanent, that my resources were guaranteed, that my patience had no end. And once someone believes that, respect doesn't just fade, it's replaced. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone rewrite history while you paid the cost? Have you ever been taken for granted because you didn't demand recognition? Have you ever stayed quiet just to avoid being called difficult? If you have, you already know how this story feels. Have you seen this happen in families? Tell me in the comments, because what came next wasn't sudden, it was overdue. Sunday brunch at Pine Hollow wasn't my idea. It never was. It had become one of those traditions that existed because no one questioned it. Same time, same place, same expectation that I would show up without needing to be asked. I dressed carefully that morning, not to impress anyone, but to avoid standing out. I chose clothes I knew wouldn't draw comments, neutral, familiar, safe. Before leaving, I checked the small gift wrapped on my kitchen table. It fit neatly into my purse. Something meaningful, something old, something I hoped would remind my grandson that family history mattered. I hesitated for a moment before locking the door. I don't know why, just a feeling I couldn't name. The parking lot was already full when I arrived. I found their vehicles immediately. It wasn't difficult. My son's SUV sat polished and spotless, catching the light. Beside it was my daughter-in-law's crossover, recently detailed, expensive, unmistakable. I parked my sedan a few spaces away. It wasn't new, it wasn't impressive, but it ran perfectly, just like it always had. As I stepped out, I noticed a few heads turn. People tend to notice contrasts. I smoothed my skirt, adjusted my bag, and walked toward the entrance at my usual pace. No rush, no hesitation. Still, I felt it, that quiet awareness that I didn't match the scene the way I used to. Inside, the room buzzed with conversation. Silverware clinked, chairs scraped softly across the floor. Everyone seemed busy being seen. I scanned the space until I spotted my family's table in the corner. They were already seated, plates half full, drinks poured. They hadn't waited. My son was mid-conversation with someone important. My daughter-in-law leaned close, laughing at something I hadn't heard. My grandson sat between them, absorbed in a screen. I paused before approaching. It wasn't anger that stopped me. It was awareness. I adjusted my grip on my purse and walked toward them anyway, wearing the same polite smile I always did. As I reached the table, my hand brushed against the gift inside my purse. I had spent time choosing it, not money, time. It was something my husband had kept carefully for years, a small piece of family history, something meant to be passed down. I imagined my grandson's reaction, curiosity maybe, a question or two, a moment of connection. That's what I hoped for. I thought about how rarely children are taught where they come from, how quickly stories disappear when no one tells them. I was still holding on to that thought when I reached for the empty chair beside him. Before I could sit, something changed. Not a sound, not a word, a pause. My grandson moved his bag onto the chair I was reaching for, slowly, deliberately. I laughed softly, assuming it was a game. Children test boundaries, that's normal. "Sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice light, "could you move that so Grandma can sit?" He didn't look up right away. When he did, His expression wasn't playful, it was practiced. That was the moment the room felt different. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong. I was still standing, my hand still hovered near the chair. Around us, conversations continued. No one noticed the pause stretching between us. No one sensed what was about to happen. I waited for my son to intervene, for my daughter-in-law to correct him, for someone, anyone, to speak. No one did. And in that silence, I understood something was coming, something I couldn't soften, something I couldn't undo. I didn't know the words yet, but I knew the impact. I was still standing when my grandson finally spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He pushed his bag fully onto the chair and said, "No, you can't sit here." Not loudly, not nervously, confidently. I smiled at first. Old habits die hard. I thought he was playing. Children test limits all the time. "Why not?" I asked gently. That's when he looked up at me properly, not like a child seeking attention, like someone repeating something he'd heard often enough to believe it. His eyes didn't flick to his parents for approval. He already had it. "You're a nobody," he said. The word landed hard, not because it came from him, but because it didn't come from him. He kept going. "Dad says we only bring you so people think we're nice. You don't have a real job. You're just extra." Each sentence stacked neatly on top of the last, rehearsed, clean, final. I felt something inside me go still, not pain, recognition. Children don't invent language like that. They borrow it, they absorb it, they repeat what feels safe to say at home. Around us, forks paused midair, a few heads turned. I waited. Surely someone would stop this. Surely my son would step in. Surely my daughter-in-law would correct him. They didn't. Instead, my son laughed. Not an awkward laugh, not a strained one, a full laugh. He leaned back in his chair like he'd just heard something clever, like the truth had finally slipped out in an amusing way. "Well," he said, glancing at the man sitting across from him, "kids are honest." A few people chuckled. Someone shook their head like this was charming. I looked at my son, really looked at him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That told me everything. My daughter-in-law smiled next. She dabbed her mouth with her napkin and said, "He's not wrong, Evelyn." She said my name the way people do when they're correcting a mistake. "You don't really fit what we're doing today. This is more of a professional setting." Professional? I glanced around the table I paid dues for, the room I helped fund. She continued, "Why don't you grab something in the lounge? We'll call you when we're ready to go." Not if, when. I was being dismissed, in public, by people who depended on me, and no one objected. That's when the laughter spread. Not everyone, not loudly, but enough. Enough smiles, enough murmurs, enough people enjoying a moment that didn't belong to them. Someone nearby said, "Kids say the funniest things." Another person laughed like this was harmless. I stood there holding my purse, the gift pressing against my side like a weight. No one told my grandson to apologize. No one told my son to stop. No one told my daughter-in-law she'd crossed a line. Because lines only exist when someone enforces them, and I hadn't. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I repeated one word quietly: nobody. It didn't shake. It didn't crack. That surprised me. I realized then that something had ended, not my love, but my tolerance. I looked at my son one last time. He still wouldn't look back. Let me ask you something now. Was this just a child being blunt, or was this learned cruelty spoken out loud? Because what a child repeats tells you exactly what they hear when doors are closed. Tell me what you think. Was this just a child or learned cruelty? And if this makes you angry, good. Subscribe. Stories like this are closer than you think. I didn't wait for anyone to finish speaking. I didn't excuse myself. I picked up my purse and stepped back from the table. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. My absence mattered as little as my presence had moments before. As I walked away, I heard chairs scrape and conversations resume. Life continued exactly as it always did for people who believe they've won. I moved through the room calmly. My steps were steady. My breathing was even. That surprised me. I expected shaking, heat, tears. None came. I reached the doorway just as the laughter returned. Not sharp, not cruel. Casual. The kind of laughter people use when they're comfortable, when they assume there are no consequences. It followed me into the hallway, faint but clear enough to understand. They thought it was over. They thought I was retreating. I paused for a moment with my hand on the door, not because I was weak, but because I was memorizing the feeling, that sound, because I knew I wouldn't hear it again from them. The drive home passed quietly. Traffic lights changed, cars merged. The world moved on like nothing had happened. Inside the car, I felt oddly calm, not peaceful, focused. I didn't replay the words. I didn't argue with ghosts in my head. I didn't imagine clever responses I should have said. There was no point. What mattered now wasn't what they'd said. It was what I'd allowed and what I was about to change. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sadness had settled into something cleaner, resolve. I understood something then that took me years to accept. Being kind doesn't require being available. Being generous doesn't require being silent. I had mistaken patience for strength. They had mistaken my restraint for weakness. Both of us were wrong. I didn't go inside right away. I sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, and made a decision that didn't involve anger or revenge. I decided I was done explaining myself, done justifying what I gave, done protecting people who wouldn't protect me. Whatever happened next would happen because I allowed it, and for the first time that day, I smiled. Not because I felt better, but because I knew something they didn't. When I stepped into my house, I didn't go to the kitchen. I didn't make tea. I didn't sit down. I walked straight to the small room at the back of the house, the one Preston liked to joke about. He called it my hobby room, said it smelled like old books and wasted time. He never asked what I did in there. The door closed softly behind me. The noise of the day faded. What remained was quiet, the kind that allows thinking. I turned on the lamp, sat at my desk, and opened the bottom drawer. That's where I kept the truth. The ledger was heavier than it looked, leather-bound, worn at the edges, organized in my handwriting. Every property, every payment, every signature. I ran my fingers over the page where E.M. Legacy was written in neat ink. Most people assumed it was a firm run by a group of investors, a name without a face, a presence without a voice. That assumption protected me. E.M. stood for my initials, not a secret, just never advertised. I flipped through pages slowly, not because I needed to remember, but because I wanted to appreciate what patience builds. This wasn't luck. It was years of decisions made quietly and held firmly. The first file I opened was labeled with an address Preston knew well, the glass-fronted office building where he ran his firm. He loved that place, loved bringing clients there, loved the way it made him feel established. What he forgot or chose not to remember was how he got it. I bought that building when his student loans were still active, paid cash, set the lease so low it barely covered taxes, $1 a year. I'd prepared renewal paperwork weeks ago, 5 more years at the same rate, no increase, no questions. I deleted it. Then I pulled up the current lease. The end date was clear, the terms were clear, the breach clauses were very clear. Ownership has advantages, so does timing. Next came the house. 5 bedrooms, manicured lawn, quiet street. Prestige wrapped in brick and paint. Preston talked about it like a trophy, like proof he'd arrived. The truth sat in a trust document labeled Oak Crest. My signature was at the bottom, so was the authority. They didn't own that house. They lived in it. I paid the taxes. I handled the association fees. I approved every change. They were tenants with privileges they never questioned. I reviewed the terms once more, then updated the status. Privileges can be withdrawn. The credit cards came next. 3 corporate cards under my primary account, issued for business use, used for everything else. Restaurants, clothing, weekend trips, tuition deposits. I scrolled through recent charges without emotion. There was a time I would have felt embarrassed, a time I would have worried about confrontation. That time had passed. I picked up the phone, verified my identity, and suspended all 3 cards. No drama, no warnings, just facts. Convenience disappears quickly when the source goes silent. The last item was the easiest. Every month, on the same day, a transfer went out. Payroll support, emergency padding, peace of mind. He called it temporary help. It had lasted years. I toggled the automation off. One switch, gone. I leaned back in my chair and considered the question that mattered most. What happens when this stops? I didn't smile. I didn't feel excited. I felt settled, because power isn't loud when it's real. It doesn't rush. It doesn't explain. It waits until it's needed. And tomorrow morning, they would notice. I didn't sleep right away that night. Not because I was upset, because my mind was clear. I went through my usual routine, locked the doors, set the thermostat, placed my purse where it always went. Life didn't need to look different yet. At 11:30, my phone buzzed on the table beside me. I didn't rush to check it. Some habits take years to build. Others take one moment to break. When I finally picked it up, I already knew who it was from. The screen lit up with his name. No greeting, no concern, no acknowledgement of what had happened earlier that day, just logistics. He wrote about schedules, cash flow, timing, the usual. Then the line that told me everything I needed to know. He wanted to confirm the monthly transfer, needed to be sure it would arrive in the morning. Payroll depended on it. There was no apology tucked between sentences, no question about how I was feeling, no hint that he'd replayed the scene at the table even once. To him, the day hadn't ended in humiliation. It had ended in inconvenience. I read the message twice, not because it was confusing, but because it was honest. This was how he saw me now, not as a mother, not as someone who deserved respect, as a function. I thought about the chair, the words, the laughter. I waited for anger to rise. It didn't. What came instead was certainty. I didn't draft a response. I didn't soften it. I typed 2 words. Figure it out. I hit send. The message showed as read almost immediately. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. I didn't wait to see what he would say next. Some conversations don't deserve follow-up. I turned my phone off and placed it face down. That mattered more than the words themselves. For years, I had been available, reachable, responsive. That night, I wasn't. Silence can be uncomfortable for people who rely on access. It forces them to sit with uncertainty, with consequences they didn't expect. I slept deeply. If you're still listening, pay attention. This wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was a boundary drawn without explanation. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back to how things were. If you're still watching, you already know why. I woke up just after 6. No alarm, no urgency. The house was quiet the way it always had been. I made coffee, opened the curtains, and stood by the window for a moment, watching the morning settle into place. Only then did I turn my phone back on. It vibrated immediately. Once, twice, again. The screen filled faster than I could read it. Missed calls, text messages, voicemails stacking one on top of another. I didn't open any of them. Not yet. I recognized the pattern instantly. This wasn't concern. This wasn't regret. This was alarm. Calls from my son, calls from unfamiliar numbers, messages from people who never contacted me directly unless something had gone wrong. I let the phone sit on the counter while I finished my coffee. After years of managing properties, I'd learned something important. Systems fail quietly. People don't. Whatever had started breaking, it had done so early, and it had done so publicly. The first voicemail came from someone named Diane. She sounded professional, but only barely. She explained there was an issue at the office. Cards weren't going through. Vendors were calling. Staff were waiting for instructions. She asked me to call her back as soon as possible. I deleted the message. Then another came in. Same voice, less composed. By the third, she was no longer asking. She was pleading. Later, I learned what had happened around the same time. My daughter-in-law had gone shopping early. She always preferred to go before crowds arrived. At the register, her card declined. She tried again. Declined. She laughed it off at first, asked the clerk to try another terminal, reached for her phone. Same result. By the time she stepped aside to make a call, the irritation had set in, the kind that comes from embarrassment mixed with disbelief. Convenience is easy to take for granted until it disappears. Across town, my son arrived at his office expecting an ordinary day. He didn't get one. The front door wouldn't unlock. A notice had been taped neatly at eye level. Formal language, clear terms, no room for interpretation. The lease had ended. The conditions had not been met. Access was no longer permitted. He stood there reading it twice, then a third time, as if the words might change. They didn't. By mid-morning, my phone was impossible to ignore. 40 missed calls, messages marked urgent, names I hadn't seen in years. I didn't answer, because the truth was simple. Everything they were experiencing had been avoidable. What they felt now wasn't confusion, it was consequence. By mid-morning, my phone was impossible to ignore. 40 missed calls, messages marked urgent, names I hadn't seen in years. I didn't answer, because the truth was simple. Everything they were experiencing had been avoidable. What they felt now wasn't confusion, it was consequence. I was at a small diner when he walked in. I recognized his steps before I saw him. Too fast, too heavy. He looked nothing like the man from the country club. His jacket was rumpled, his tie loose, his confidence gone. "Mom," he said, sliding into the seat across from me without waiting. His voice cracked when he spoke next. Cards declined, office locked, staff calling him nonstop. His words came out rushed, tangled, desperate. He demanded explanations. I listened quietly. For the first time in years, he was talking to me, not past me. I didn't correct him. I didn't comfort him. I let him speak until there was nothing left to say. Then I took a slow sip of my coffee and met his eyes. What he saw there wasn't anger, it was finality. Now, let me ask you something. After everything you've heard, After years of being dismissed, laughed at, and used, did he deserve this? Tell me what you think, because consequences don't need shouting to be effective. They just need to arrive. He didn't wait for an invitation. He slid into the booth across from me like the seat might disappear if he hesitated. His knee bounced, his hands kept adjusting his sleeves, his watch, his tie, everything except his expression. "Mom," he said again, softer this time. "Something's wrong." I didn't answer. He leaned forward. "The office won't let me in. They said the owner terminated the lease. The cards aren't working. Diane says payroll can't clear." He looked around the diner as if someone might overhear, as if shame required witnesses. "There's been a mistake," he said. "You know people. You can fix this." I stirred my coffee. When he realized I wasn't responding, his voice changed. Not angry, not commanding, pleading. "This is serious," he said. "Clients are calling. Staff are asking questions. Tinsley's freaking out." That was the first time he mentioned her feelings. He ran a hand through his hair. "Mom, I don't know what's happening. Everything just stopped." I looked at him then. Really looked. He wasn't furious. He wasn't indignant. He was afraid. And fear has a way of stripping people down to who they really are. "Who owns your office?" I asked. He blinked. "What?" "The building," I said calmly. "Who owns it?" He waved a hand. "Some holding company, EM something. That's not the point." "It is," I replied. He frowned. "Mom, why are you asking that now?" I set my spoon down. "Because you're sitting here asking me to fix something you never bothered to understand. I am EM Legacy," I said. He laughed once, short, uncertain. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking." The color drained from his face slowly, like someone turning down a dimmer switch. "No," he said, "that's not possible." "Evelyn Montgomery," I continued. "Those are my initials. I bought that building years ago. I set your lease. I approved every extension." He stared at me, mouth slightly open. The booth suddenly felt too small for him. Before he could interrupt, I continued. "The house you live in," I said, "it's held in a trust. Mine. You don't own it." His breath caught. "The cards you use," I added, "they're issued under my account. Business use only. I let it slide." He shook his head. "No. "The monthly transfer," I said evenly, "that was never temporary. It was support you stopped acknowledging." He pushed his hands against the table now, palms flat like the world might tip. "You can't do this," he said. I already did. He reached for explanations the way drowning people reach for air. "Riker didn't mean it. He's just a kid. We were joking. You know how things sound in public." I waited until he finished. Then I said, "You laughed." He looked down. "You laughed while your son told me I was nothing." Silence settled between us. "I didn't think you'd take it this far," he said quietly. That sentence mattered more than anything else he'd said. Not "I'm sorry," not "I was wrong," just surprise that consequences existed. "You mistook my patience for permission. That's a common mistake." His shoulders slumped. The man across from me now looked smaller, not because I'd grown, but because the illusion had failed. "We'll lose everything," he whispered. I met his eyes. "No," I said. "You'll lose what you didn't earn." He tried once more. "What do you want?" he asked. The question itself told me how far things had fallen. "I want peace and distance." I stood, placing a few bills on the table. "I'm done carrying what you refuse to respect." He didn't follow me. He couldn't. As I walked toward the door, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Power doesn't require witnesses when it's real. And if you're listening closely, understand this. Only subscribers hear how this ends. Let me be clear about something. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't enjoy watching my son panic. This wasn't about humiliation. I had already lived through enough of that. What I did next wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by truth I had ignored for too long. People often confuse restraint with weakness. They assume silence means surrender, but silence can also mean patience, and patience, once exhausted, doesn't explode. It ends. The house didn't go on the market that day. I didn't rush it. The trust issued formal notice, clear language, a reasonable timeline, 30 days to vacate, or the option to negotiate fair terms. No tricks, no pressure, no shortcuts. I made sure everything was done properly, cleanly, legally, because the point wasn't to put them on the street. The point was to remove the illusion that something they didn't earn was guaranteed. Security should never be confused with entitlement. The office space was handled the same way. Market terms were offered. Nothing extreme, nothing punitive. He could stay if he paid what everyone else paid. That was the difference. For years, he had benefited from generosity disguised as normalcy. Once that support was removed, reality felt unfair. It wasn't. It was simply unfamiliar. I didn't interfere with his work. I didn't contact his clients. I didn't make phone calls behind his back. I let the system operate as it was designed to. That's not revenge. That's accountability. I didn't announce my decisions to anyone. There was no speech, no explanation tour. I stopped answering questions that weren't asked respectfully. I redirected calls to legal representatives. I protected my time. For the first time in years, my days belonged to me. I started walking in the mornings, reading books I'd put off, making plans that didn't revolve around solving someone else's problems. No one clapped for that, and that was the point. My son called once more. This time, his voice was quieter, not panicked, not demanding, resigned. He said he finally understood. I didn't argue with him. Understanding doesn't need confirmation. I told him I hoped he figured things out for his own sake, not mine. Then I ended the call. Some lessons don't need to be repeated. I slept well after that, not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped losing myself. There's a difference. Walking away doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes it means you finally chose yourself, and that choice doesn't require permission. I've spent most of my life building things people never noticed. Not titles, not attention, stability. Strong foundations don't ask for praise. They don't announce themselves. They sit quietly and hold weight year after year. But here's what people forget. A foundation isn't meant to be abused. It isn't meant to be mocked, and it isn't meant to be kicked just because it doesn't speak up. When you treat support like it's disposable, you learn very quickly what happens when it's removed. That's not punishment. That's physics. If you're listening to this and thinking, this could never happen in my family, be careful. Disrespect doesn't arrive all at once. It grows when no one challenges it, when jokes go unchecked, when silence feels easier than correction. Families fall apart not because of money, but because of arrogance. Because people forget who carried them when they couldn't stand on their own. Love doesn't mean tolerating everything, and loyalty doesn't mean erasing yourself. If you rely on someone, treat them accordingly. Children repeat what they hear. They don't understand context. They don't understand consequences. They understand permission. When adults speak carelessly, children learn cruelty early. When adults laugh at disrespect, children learn it's acceptable. That lesson stays. If you don't correct it, the world eventually will, and the world is rarely gentle. If you're young and listening to this, hear me clearly. Pay attention to how the adults in your life treat people who help them. Notice who gets thanked and who gets ignored. One day, you'll stand where they stand, and when that day comes, the habits you learned will follow you. Choose carefully what you repeat. I didn't share this story for sympathy. I shared it because stories like this don't announce themselves until it's too late. Most people don't think they need boundaries until they do, and by then, the cost is higher. If this story scared you, you should already be subscribed because awareness comes before regret. And if you won't subscribe, comment why. I'm listening. Some lessons are expensive. Others are free if you pay attention.